Hello, I'm Barry Grimes. I'm the production editor of the World Happiness Report. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation about happiness and social media. Everyone you will hear from in this event is giving their time for free, and they're here to answer any questions you may have about the research in this year's report. I'm delighted to introduce our host, Dr. Sian Williams, who has generously stepped in at short notice to be an independent and objective moderator of the discussions to come. Sian is a chartered counselling psychologist working with emergency responders in the UK's National Health Service to manage anxiety, stress and trauma. She is also a broadcaster with a 40-year career across radio and television, including over a decade as the anchor of BBC Breakfast. Sian has just released her second book called The Power of Anxiety: How to Ride the Worry Wave, which looks at how to manage anxiety better and includes a chapter on the search for happiness, which references the World Happiness Report. Sian, thank you so much for doing this. Over to you.
Thank you, Barry. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone, and happy International Day of Happiness to you all. Welcome if you're just joining us. We have about an hour and a half, 2 hours of fascinating insights into the World Happiness Report, including the headlines, who's up, who's down, and why, and also how much young people's well-being is linked to social media. We've got some amazing panelists coming up as well, including Professor Lord Richard Layard, one of the report's authors, Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Anxious Generation, and Andy Przybylski from Oxford Internet Institute. So we have viewpoints from all sides. Stay until the end if you can. And as Barry said, you can add your questions and your comments too via the live chat on YouTube or LinkedIn. We're going to kick off with a video from some of the report's editors explaining how the rankings are constructed and which countries are doing well and which countries are struggling.
What makes the good life? Does money buy happiness? Is happiness a choice? Which country is the happiest?
We compute the average life satisfaction within each country by taking the average response from roughly 1,000 people per year and look at how they evaluate their life as a whole on a one-item measure.
That asked people to rate their life as a whole on a scale from 0 for the worst possible life, 10 for the best possible. How do they rate their state of life these days?
Top of the rankings again this year are the Nordic countries. Why?
They do have a lot of prosperity, but importantly, that wealth is distributed much more equally than we find in other places. The second thing is they've got a healthy life expectancy, wonderful public health systems that are affordable. The third element is social support.
These findings are a real challenge to other countries if they want to be happier, to study how the Nordic countries do it.
Latin American countries perform better than their level of income would suggest. Costa Rica has risen to 4th in this year's rankings, the highest ever position for a Latin American country. Why is this?
The value and importance of the family as a centerpiece, the links across generations that other countries strive to maintain.
And what countries have seen the biggest improvements in happiness?
In the Central and Eastern European countries, we've seen a whole point increase on a scale from 0 to 10 over the past decade and a half, which is a lot. Places like Lithuania, Serbia, Slovenia, etc.
And especially their younger generations. That's a hugely positive bit of human history.
And where is happiness falling?
Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. Here are some of the global rankings of these countries, along with other Western industrialized countries, have dropped significantly, in large part due to lower levels of life satisfaction reported by youth under the age of 25.
Conflict is, of course, the absolute destroyer of happiness. So countries like Afghanistan, Venezuela, and so on have been plunging.
Finally, what's the most important message from the World Happiness Report?
It's to measure, cherish, and build good lives for themselves, yes, but for other people especially.
A successful outcome for a country is how happy people are.
There's now an alternative to thinking about GDP as a measure of social progress.
Happiness can be studied and measured scientifically, can be translated into policies and everyday practices that can improve people's lives.
The World Happiness Report would not be what it is without the generous and extraordinary contribution of the author teams contributing chapters each year. It would also not be what it is today without the partnership with Gallup, who provide the survey data underpinning the rankings. We also thank our sponsors, and finally, the extraordinary team working so hard behind the scenes to bring the report to life each year.
Read the report to find out more.
Well, that's a very good taster of the discussion we're about to have here. Just to say, we've got people joining us from Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Portugal, all around the world. So this really is a global discussion we're having today. I'm joined now by those four editors you saw in that video. John Helliwell, who's Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of British Columbia. Professor Lord Richard Layard from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Jan-Emmanuel de Neve, who's Professor of Economics and Behavioural Science at the University of Oxford. And Lara Aknin, who's Distinguished Professor of Social Psychology at Simon Fraser University. John, let's start with you. You are one of the founding editors of this report. Tell us how the report got started and how it's evolved over the years.
As Richard will remember, it got started by a Bhutanese resolution in 2011, led by Jeffrey Sachs and the Prime Minister Jigme Thinley of Bhutan, advocating that members take happiness and well-being seriously in their forming of national policies. That resolution passed, and a meeting was held in the summer of that year in Thimphu to say what next. And a high-level meeting was planned for April of 2012. And it was Jeffrey, I think, who said, we really have to have a scientific report to launch that meeting at the United Nations. If they're going to take well-being seriously, they have to know what it is they're taking seriously, what determines happiness, how you measure it. And so that was the first report. And it was treated as so important and so different from what people had otherwise as measures of how nations are doing. That interest was so great we couldn't stop doing it. So we now switched over from once every 18 months for the first reports. It's now every year, as it is this year, on World Happiness Day.
Yes, and here we are, 2026. Some people, Richard, refer to the report as the World Happiness Index. That's not correct, though, is it? Can you explain how the ranking of countries is produced and why you follow that approach?
Yes, no, it's not an index. It's a very simple question. Essentially, it's how satisfied are you with your life on a scale of 0 to 10? And we see the incredible variety of life on Earth by the answers that people give. Some countries down as low as 2, some countries up nearly to 8. So this is the picture which is given. And the reason why we want a single question is to encapsulate really what is the most important aspect of life, which is essentially whether people are enjoying themselves, feeling fulfilled, feeling satisfied. That we think should be the goal of government. It should be the goal indeed of any organization. But in particular, in this context, it should be the goal of government. And when you think about it, I mean, if you're the Chancellor of the Exchequer and you've got ministers coming asking for money for this, that, and the other, how are you going to decide between it? You can only decide between them if you've got a single criterion which you're using to judge it by. Now, some people would produce an index, which would be a sort of average across all the different things which they think contribute to happiness. But that's, of course, a confusion, because who's going to determine the weights? If happiness is the overarching thing that matters, that should be the only criterion for the allocation of public money. So we've got this single measure. It's really extraordinarily informative. And of course, the virtue of it is that we can then try to explain it. So this is a perfect way to try and understand what is producing the huge variety of human experience. And if you take the country averages, which are the rankings, if you take the country averages, John, who just spoke to you, has done a wonderful study. He does it each year in the World Happiness Report of the factors influencing it. They are, of course, income and health, you would expect that, but also social support and trust, corruption, freedom, pro-social activity. And this helps us to understand why there's this extraordinary phenomenon that the Nordic countries are always at the top, because they, of course, are so strong on the idea that we should be there for each other. We're not there to do better than other people. We're there to support other people. And that explains another very interesting thing that's been going on, which is that by comparison with most countries, there's been a spectacular fall in happiness in many English-speaking countries, and a rise in negative emotions peculiar to English-speaking countries, which are, of course, so very competitive when we compare them with the Nordic countries. So our children are growing up with this idea that your job in life is to get better grades than somebody else and get a better job. Whereas we want a society, if you want to get high in the rankings, where people are told, no, your job is there to contribute and support others.
I remember talking to you about this, Richard, about 15 years ago when you were saying we should be talking about caring and sharing, because that's the thing that leads to happiness societally. And of course, caring and sharing is the theme of this International Day of Happiness. And while the Cantrell ladder, that ladder of sort of, you know, the best possible life and the worst possible life, and where do you rank yourself on that ladder, is the question you ask for the report. You do bring all these other factors in, which gives a more complex picture, I guess, of where happiness is in various places in the world. So it might be a good idea to bring in just that picture of the top 10 countries so that we can see. You mentioned the Nordic countries doing well. Again, Finland at the top. Let's have a look now at where those top 10 countries stand, shall we? I think we've got a graphic that shows this, where Finland has been top of those rankings for 9 years. And the other Nordic countries are all in the top 6. I wonder, Lara, what is the secret for Finland? What do Finland and the Nordic countries do that other countries don't?
I think Finland and many of the Scandinavian countries are ranking or reporting high levels of many of these top predictors of explanatory factors. So as Richard pointed out, we rank countries based on people's self-reported life evaluations, but we can understand variation in these rankings through 6 kind of top predictive factors. And so there's income and there's healthy life expectancy, but as Richard also alluded to, there's social support, there's a freedom to make life choices, a sense of engaging in generous actions and trusting one's fellow country folk as well as the government. And so I think a lot of Finland and many of these other Scandinavian countries have developed these strong systems of welfare states and generosity that provide extensive social benefits, including healthcare, income security, childcare, public funded education through post-secondary. And a lot of this is supported by high levels of public taxation. And these offerings provide a lot of freedom and autonomy for people to make important life decisions. And the services they provide, like school and healthcare, work. They build trust in people's governments, and they are representations of people engaging in supportive actions for other people and benefiting in a formalized way from help from others. And so I think it builds and facilitates this sense of trust in others.
And Jan, since the report started in 2012, you've seen big changes in the rankings. What do you think is driving that?
Thank you, Sian. Well, as Lara and Richard and John already alluded to, there's a bit of stability right at the top, obviously with Finland. I guess it's now 9 years running, and then it was Denmark just before them. But that hides a lot of movement lower down the rankings, if you will. And if we can call up the countries that have made the biggest progress in terms of quality of life as people experience it, and we should be seeing countries like Serbia, where you find, for example, there's almost 2 points jump in life evaluations over the course of the measurement, which started thanks to Gallup back in about 2005, 2006. So we're almost 2 decades in, and they've made almost 2 points of progress on that scale from 0 to 10, which is huge if you know anything about well-being science. That's a big jump. But it's not just Serbia or Bulgaria or Romania or Lithuania. It's essentially all of Central and Eastern Europe. So if there's one thing that really stands out, it's the Central and Eastern European countries and a number of other countries in the Global South that have made these movements. And it's partially driven by their youth. And so while all of these populations have made gradual increase, you've seen a gradual increase across the population, whether young, middle-aged, or older. It's really their youth that has been driving a positive change in their life evaluations, averages, which make up the ranking. And this is interesting because you'll see the corollary later today, where we've seen obviously youth drive the ranking order down for much of the English-speaking world. And so there is another story to be told here too, or there's a coin that has 2 sides. And so, in a way, the other argument I'd make is this also mirrors some of the economics dynamics that we're seeing globally. There's a bit of a convergence happening. We often talk about inequality within countries, which is certainly rising, but there's actually a less inequality when you look between countries, economically speaking. And this is what you're sort of picking up here in the World Happiness Report as well. So this convergence, where countries that started lower in terms of life satisfaction are moving up, especially Central and Eastern Europe, and then others are slightly coming down. Maybe we should have a look at the other list. The very bottom of the World Happiness Report is a much sadder story, needless to say. Here you'll see essentially at the very bottom of the report, you'll find people that are in war-torn countries and that have seen extraordinary drops. And most striking, of course, is Afghanistan. With the reintroduction of the Taliban about a decade or so ago, you saw really well-being, satisfaction with life falling off a cliff in that country. But you also see it in places like Lebanon, who've had it very rough over the past decade, and so on and so forth. So there's no fooling around. If there's civil strife, conflict, war, or war being waged upon one, then that is obviously undermining the core building blocks of what makes for a good life. But that being said, even in populations that are suffering from the most greatest sort of misery because of internal or external strife, you'll still find pockets and hopeful messages around coming together, fellow feeling, and sort of teaming up against other evils that can, to some extent, bolster against the larger drops because of these external factors. Anyway, long story short, there's a lot of movement below the top 10. And then there's a really wonderful story around Costa Rica as well, rising to the very top.
Yes, John, Costa Rica has moved up to 4th this year. That's the highest ever ranking for a Latin American country. Why do Latin American countries report high levels of happiness despite having a lower GDP figure, perhaps, than elsewhere?
Well, we've had a lot of study of that over the years because it's been true right from the beginning. We have one model that applies to the whole world, and then we see if this model applies equally everywhere. And we find if we put in a little variable that says, well, let's just see in Latin America, are things different there? It pops up, and it's been popping up for a dozen years now, an extra half point of happiness there than our model would predict. And we've had special chapters on it and Latin American experts. And one of the reasons is we don't measure all the right variables. So there are some surveys that say, how much time do you spend with your family? How much do you like your family? A whole range of questions about what's social life like for you. And these measures are higher in Latin America than elsewhere, and Latin Americans care about them more. So that in some countries, three-generational families exist because they have to. The kids don't have enough money to buy a place for themselves. In Latin America, it's because they want to. And that extra warmth and strength of those close-in social connections are really extraordinarily important, and they give them that extra half point. You then have Costa Rica, which is a focus this year because it is right up there with the Nordic countries. It's always been the highest among the Latin American countries, and in general, it's because its warmth extends beyond the local networks more than in other countries, and they've got a stronger set of public trusted institutions than elsewhere that then deliver the high quality and caring services throughout the country.
That's a really important point, isn't it, John? Because I was in Finland last year, and trust in public institutions was incredibly important there in bolstering their nation's feeling of happiness. Just a comment from Canada, from Asna Santhi on LinkedIn. Thank you very much, Asna, who says, sad to see we've dropped in our happiness ranking. Why has Canada dropped, John? Do we know?
Well, we're looking at it for sure. We've got, if you compare across Canada relative to the other English-speaking countries, we've talked about them moving down generally together relative to other countries, and Canada is one of those. We have a big difference in Canada, for example, between Quebec and the rest of Canada, where Quebec on its own would rank up there with the Nordics, and the rest of Canada would be down in the 30s. And so some of this angst that is shared among the young, especially in English-speaking countries, is felt as strongly or more strongly among the young in Anglophone Canada than in those other countries. And one of the things that our research is showing is important is that people's worries about affordability of housing and the availability now and in the future of employment. Both of those are treated very importantly by Canadian youth and are worse for them relative to the past and relative to what they expected than in other countries. But still, that drop is so big, it's hard to square with even these difficult circumstances.
Yes, and you mentioned the focus on young people. Richard, this year's report does have that focus and the effect that social media is having on their well-being, something we're going to discuss a little later. Why did you decide to focus on that particular topic?
Well, there has, in the English-speaking countries, been this remarkable fall in youth well-being over the last 15 years or so. And of course, at the same time, there's been the huge increase in social media use, which naturally leads to the question, is the second causing the first? And there seems to be quite a lot of evidence that it is. There's the evidence that people who watch social media for a longer period of time are less happy than those who use it for a much shorter period of time. There's evidence for surveys, I expect John will talk about this, but surveys where students have been asked, would you feel better off if there were no social media? The majority are saying they would feel better off if there were no social media. They just use the social media because everybody else is using that. So there's obviously the problems with social media that, number one, they take time away from ordinary face-to-face human relationships, which are what has provided happiness to mankind ever since we started. But obviously the second thing is that they may themselves be causing problems in terms of encouraging unhelpful comparisons between people and their fellows or the influencer or whoever else they're looking at. They see the best of somebody else's life and compare it with their own average, and they feel they're surely missing out on something. So it's not healthy to have a major institution which is promoting more social comparisons, because that whole line of human behavior, obviously it's very deep in our nature, but it can lead to a lot of unhappiness. If your main aim is to do better than other people, that's a zero-sum game. Whoever does better has to mean that somebody else does worse. So we want instead this a more pro-social culture. And I can't help mentioning that since Sian is there, she helped us launch a movement called Action for Happiness about 15 years ago, where the members pledge to try in their lives to create as much happiness as they can. And I think that is really what we want readers of this report to adopt as their own objective. That's what we're here for, and it will make other people happier. It'll make us happy. I can't help by then reflecting, and this is one of the big issues in the report, that although it seems very convincing that there has been a fall in youth happiness in English-speaking countries that's partly caused by social media. Social media are used as much in other parts of the world as in English-speaking countries, and yet there hasn't been this fall in youth happiness. So that's something that has got to be explained. I think it must be partly to do with these cultural phenomena that I've been talking about. In a very individualistic culture, the social media really have that power to immiserate by people constantly comparing themselves with other people. That capacity of them to make you miserable may be less in less individualistic cultures.
Yes, that toxicity of social comparison. We're going to hear from young people in just a moment, but I wonder, before we do that, and we're going to look at the case against social media, whether we can hear briefly from Lara about the process the editors followed to create this year's report, selecting the authors. How did you get as well the different kinds of evidence? Where do you look?
Well, our amazing author team brought their own evidence to bear. So motivated by the data that Richard mentioned in our report 2 years ago about generational differences and how the younger adults, those under the age of 30, had been declining in Western and English-speaking countries. We posed this question about whether social media might be a main culprit. And so we turned to some of the leading voices on this matter. And I believe it was Richard who extended first an arm to Jonathan Haidt and his senior research assistant, Zach Rausch, invited them to contribute a chapter. They provided an outline. And then from there, we shared this along with an open call to authors and invitations. And so we received a number of submissions, and we were able, through an evaluation process with the editorial team, to consider a wide array of international evidence that brought to bear various different sources of evidence and also opinions to try to offer a balanced and informative report.
And we'll be hearing from Jonathan Haidt, Zach Rausch and Jean Twenge in just a moment. But Jan, just to conclude this panel discussion, as the director of the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford, where this report is published, in what ways has wellbeing research had an impact on decision makers, do you think?
Well, Sian, in a way, it's through the World Happiness Report is possibly its most influential pathway to impact onto policymakers. So we know that the heads of state, like the Finnish president earlier today, tweeted about this. So it's very much on their radar. We know it's government leaders around the world take note of the World Happiness Report, partially, needless to say, thanks to the way it resonates in the media. So the fact that it is written about across about 10,000 or so articles each year, touches millions of people directly and indirectly. The report gets millions of downloads. That spreads throughout the world, and I think it's picked up by government leaders, policymakers. Importantly, if I may, I think its main impact has been to allow people to think differently around what a good society might look like. Before, I think, the World Happiness Report, if you'd ask people where are people living the happiest lives, they would probably say, well, we guess in the richest country. And I think the World Happiness Report has shown that there's much more to life than just living in a wealthy country, but rather how it distributes that wealth, how it cares about each other, and our healthy lives. And so we find that I think it's sort of infiltrated the social psyche of humans around the world to think differently around what a good society might look like, or give them examples. And then obviously people tend to pinpoint straight to the Scandinavian or Nordic countries as an example of this. And I think we should all be very proud of this. But the report, and this is more looking at all the academics and the wonderful contributors over the years, the report over the past decade and a half has brought together the entire field of subjective well-being science. There's well over 100 authors that have contributed to the report, and the dozens and dozens of chapters over the past, since 2012. And so I think that's been pretty powerful as sort of it's brought the field together to some extent. And I know your question was specifically about well-being science. And here, maybe just to conclude, I think it's the notion of what is a good life and how decision makers ought to try and nudge people's lives towards it is an age-old question. I mean, Aristotle has been on it already, but it's really the psychologists in the 80s and the 90s getting the measurement right, and the economists getting on board in the 90s and the 2000s, putting big data and large survey measures to work. Gallup measuring this around the world, and so on and so forth, has really, I think, leveled up the science of well-being and made it policy relevant. Because as Richard was already alluding to, if you're the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the fancy English word for Minister of Finance, well, what happens is you need to make decisions with a finite budget, and you need empirical science, cost-benefit analysis based off well-being, not just growth or GDP or future income streams, to really make up decisions. And we're finding, for example, in the United Kingdom, the Green Book, which is the policy manual, there's a supplement to it that now incorporates well-being. And the Office for National Statistics around here measures well-being. And we see initiatives around the world, from the United Nations to the Canadian Quality of Life Framework to the Australians to the Bhutanese, all around the world you see attempts, policy frameworks building off of the empirical science of well-being to try and move the needle in a positive direction for everyone.
Yes, and Jan, we had a message from Scott McManus on LinkedIn saying that he's very interested in your research, and perhaps employers can also be persuaded by this well-being research, and it'll filter down to employees as well. Thank you very much, Jan, Richard, John, and Lara. It's been a really fascinating panel discussion with you. I know some of you are coming back later. For the moment, thank you very much. We've been talking a lot, haven't we, about young people and the impact of things like social media on young people. Before we move to our next panel, we're going to hear from young people now about the different ways they believe social media has helped and harmed them.
Social media has been a valuable tool to learn from. It offers a lot of really good talking points as well to connect with my family and my friends.
For me, I follow funny pages that make me feel happy and that bring humor to my life. I follow fitness pages that encourage me to go to the gym, wellness pages that make me do more for my mindfulness meditation, take care of my mental health.
Social media helped me reach people I never could have otherwise. The youth that needs someone to talk to, young people from small towns that have no access to therapy, and the people who just need someone to see them.
Social media has been very helpful to me because it connected me with young change makers across the world, so that shows real power of bridging gaps through digital connection, which makes it incredibly valuable because it leaves no one behind.
With the right supervision and having parental guidance, social media can be used as something that can help teens and young adults flourish.
It can be rather hard to connect with people who live all the way across on the other side of the world, but social media has offered a wonderful opportunity to do that. I am quite hopeful that people will be able to use this to build bridges and to be able to connect different cultures, different countries, and to share interesting ideas for the future as well.
The same social media platforms where I'm helping others are also where I've felt the most broken. I've compared my life to highlight reels, I've measured my worth in like. So you can understand the research on social media harm and still fall into every trap.
It tends to disrupt my daily routine quite a bit, so I try to schedule in about 30 minutes in the morning where I just don't look at social media at all, keeping some peace and some of my time as well.
Social media can be harmful. I've personally experienced hate speech and anonymous accounts which can negatively affect mental well-being. But it can be very distracting if used without care, so it must be approached with wisdom and responsibility.
Being exposed to certain social media might be more harmful than others. But there are social media platforms that can hurt you, especially because it's such a self-comparison thing.
The question is not whether young people should be online. The question is whether these platforms are willing to protect them.
My overall opinion on social media is that it is a powerful double-edged tool. If used well, it can optimize youth engagement and advance sustainable development, especially because young people are highly receptive to digital platforms. Across Southern Africa, we've seen movements for youth entrepreneurship, climate awareness, and mental health. They've been gaining momentum largely through social media. I believe in guided digital literacy, safer platform design, and responsible use so that even young people can benefit while being protected.
Well, what fascinating insights from young people there, particularly powerful double-edged tool, one person said. The social aspect of social media, helpful. The social comparison and measuring your worth in likes, harmful. Let's kick off our discussion on social media because we're joined by two prominent critics of social media. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at New York University and author of The Anxious Generation, and Jean Twenge, who's professor of psychology at San Diego State University. Welcome both. We're going to hear alternative views from other authors later on, but John, let's start with you first. In your chapter, which is in this report, you address two separate questions about what you think are the harms of social media, a product safety question and the historical trends question. Can you explain to us the difference between the two?
Sure. So the debate over social media has been bogged down between those who say the evidence is just correlational, it's just a correlation and that doesn't prove causation, and those of us who say, well, no, actually there are many kinds of evidence and we think it proves causation. Now, the way this all started was that actually Jean Twenge was the first to really raise the alarm globally in an Atlantic article and then in her book. And what Jean was pointing out was primarily a correlation. Here were the rates of mental illness, and then when kids get on social media, smartphones around 2012, levels go up. So that is an historical correlation. That's the way a lot of social science research starts. And at the time, she was really attacked viciously. I mean, a lot of researchers were like trying to make fun of her, saying, "Oh, you're it's so dumb. It's just a correlation." And over time, what we saw is that there's so much evidence of harm, of so many different kinds of harms, and parents want to know, is this safe for my kid? And if people were saying, oh, it's just a correlation. So what we did in our paper was we said, let's set aside the question of what caused the rise around 2012. Let's just put that aside for now. And let's just look at the evidence as to whether it's harmful. And what we did was we said, wait, there are actually so many different kinds of evidence, one of which is that the kids themselves say it. And you'll hear this in Cass Sunstein's video as well. One is that the social media companies say it, at least if you look at the documents that have come out during the lawsuits. And others that the teachers, the parents. So the people who've seen this happen think that this is happening. That's not a correlation. Those are direct reports. We then also go through all of the different academic areas and show that actually they're all pretty consistently showing support. So if you keep those questions separate, then we can see that in countries where teen mental health is actually getting better, does that mean that it's safe for kids, that they're not going to get sextorted? They're not going to buy drugs that are contaminated with fentanyl? All the other dangers are there. So if everyone keeps those separate, then I think we make progress and we can realize that, you know what? Social media is really inappropriate for minors. It's an adult-only activity.
And of course, there are lots of other things coming into play as well in mental well-being among the youth. The worst period of teen suffering in the last 15 years also, of course, coincides with a pandemic. There'll be parents watching, I know, as well as policymakers today. As a mother of 5 children from between the ages of 17 and 34, I've sort of felt social media coming in, really. And I'm wondering about the other things that come in. When you talk about causation, it's quite hard, isn't it, to separate what is financial insecurity, what is the climate crisis, what is social media, to distinguish between all these different things which are playing in mental ill health in our adolescents and young people.
I think Jean should take this one because she's done such great work to show that the curves are not mapping on to any of the things you said.
Okay, Jean, do you want to pick this one up? What's your thinking? How do you sort of separate all these different strands of difficulty that young people are facing?
Yeah, it's a multi-step process. I mean, especially if we're talking about the increase in, say, teen depression and low well-being since 2012, because you're looking at individuals, of course, there's many causes of low well-being and depression. But if you're talking about what caused that huge increase in teen depression after 2012, we can immediately rule out problems in the economy because the world economy was getting better over the time that teen depression was doubling. So it doesn't seem to be financial insecurity that's the cause. Climate change is often brought up. It's true that it's something that is international that could cause anxiety. However, if climate change were the primary cause of the increase in teen depression and ill well-being, you would expect that you'd see the biggest increases among older teens and younger adults, and instead you see the biggest increases among the youngest groups. So self-harm among 10 to 14-year-old girls has quadrupled in the US, for example. And that's a behavior that's not usually linked to more abstract things like climate change. It's usually linked to things going on in friend groups. And these days, those things going on in friend groups, cyberbullying, and all of that happens on social media. So the other piece is we see huge increases in adolescent loneliness. So I first started to see that in the US, and we see that around the world, and the PISA data set as well. Why would climate change cause loneliness? There's not really a logical explanation for that. However, if teens start spending a lot more time alone in their rooms looking at a screen and a lot less time with their friends in person, which is exactly what we've seen, that would cause loneliness.
Interesting. And we'll get on to some of these points later about sort of in-person and in real life connections and the social aspect of social media, because of course there will be young people who say, you know what, it's through social media that I find my connection, and that connection leads to real life connection. It can be, I know what a complex debate this is. And I think as well, the evidence seems to differ, doesn't it? From you've looked at evidence on social media and well-being that's come from North America and Western Europe, but your chapter looks at a much broader range of countries. Have you seen differences across those countries?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this particular chapter had a more narrow focus. So I've been involved in research looking at anxiety and loneliness in samples around the world. Here, the focus was on life satisfaction. So there's big gender differences here, which comes up a fair amount. So for girls, we see that mean life satisfaction is the highest at light levels of social media use, like less than an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And then the lowest levels in almost all regions is at the heaviest use. But there's also really big variation when you start to get more granular. So if you look at the most vulnerable kids, so those who have life satisfaction somewhere between 0 and 4, that's a risk factor for depression. That's really low well-being. That's really where we need to be concerned. And there, for girls, again, in almost all regions, we see the biggest percentage with that very low life satisfaction among the heaviest users of social media. So really, I think, and this research has been consistent for a decade or maybe even two, where if social media is so great, then why would the people who use it the most have the lowest well-being? And that's especially what we see among girls. And another interesting result among girls, if you look at those with the highest life satisfaction, you choose a 10 on that 0 to 10 scale. Again, in almost all regions, it's those who don't use social media at all who have the highest life satisfaction. And I think that's really telling. It really counters this idea that I think is even more common for girls that, oh, girls have to have social media to have friends. I hear this argument all the time. Partially because I wrote this book called 10 Rules for Parents about, hey, keep your kids off social media until they're at least 16. But that's what they say. Well, they're going to be so isolated, they're not going to have friends. No, they're not going to be isolated. They're going to be protected from all of this negativity. They're going to have more time to see friends in person, more time to sleep, more time to go outside and exercise, spend time with their family, all of these other things. And they can still text their friends, and they can still call their friends, and they can still see their friends in person. It doesn't have to be algorithmic social media. Right. So we do see a little bit of a different picture for boys in this PISA data set. In Western Europe and English-speaking countries, we do see that pretty traditional link between heavy social media use and low life satisfaction, but we're not seeing that as much, at least in the means, for other regions like Central and Eastern Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. We do see the kind of traditional pattern with the heaviest users of social media being the most likely to have low life satisfaction across a lot of those regions, though not all. We do find some kind of odd results with very high life satisfaction choosing a 10, that in several countries, heavy users of social media choose that option. And I think that's a puzzle to try to replicate in other data sets, figure out what's going on. Danny Blanchflower, who's an economist at Dartmouth, has dug into what he calls the 10s, and particularly among boys, he's found that they may not be paying attention on the survey. They have low standardized test scores. They tend to be choosing the highest option on everything. So this is something we need to figure out, if there's some issues in the survey and try to replicate this because it's a pretty unusual result.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Jean, for that. Just some questions and comments from the audience before I go back to John. One here from YouTube. Like any other controlled substances, social media is best in moderation and used sparingly, if at all. It occupies too much time, it fills space and displaces other activities. Another one on YouTube. Social media has morphed over the years. What started out as a way to build community and connection, now, for me at least, feels like it's become a place for unchallenged adversarial behavior. And another one from YouTube, social media connects, but it takes too much time. Lately, I notice it's been great to use less social media. I feel more free and prefer living, quotes, the real life. John, I wonder in all your research, and Jean's too, whether there's an optimal social media usage here, whether there's a sort of happy place where you can spend X amount of time and get that social connection, but then after that, it turns into something quite harmful.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think the optimal is clearly 0. You get those little curves where it looks like maybe one is better, because that's a world in which, as Jean said, if everyone is on social media and you're not, now you're isolated. But again, in Cass Sunstein's paper, it'll be clear. Young people themselves say, they say, I would pay to get rid of TikTok if everyone else would get off it. So they're on because it's a trap. And so the optimal amount of time to spend in a trap is 0. Now, I think what you're getting at, and what one of the comments that you just read from YouTube, is that a lot of people mistake the internet for social media. And so those of us who remember the early internet in the 90s and early 2000s, it was amazing. And even early Facebook was fine. It was just like, hey, here's your page, here's my page. So when technology helps us to simply connect to people we know and like, especially one-on-one or small group, that's good. That is good for humanity. And this shows up in the World Happiness Report. We do see that in developing countries, the arrival of technology is correlated with rising youth well-being. So when you give people a cell phone, you give them WhatsApp, you give them texting, you let them communicate, that generally speaking is good. Communication is good. But the internet changed. It used to be a free, open thing where people would volunteer their time to do things. And then it became controlled by a few giant companies that developed an advertising-based business model where you use algorithms. It's not, kids are not getting reports from their friends. They're getting algorithmic feeds. The optimal amount of time for your children to have an algorithmic feed of short videos is 0.0. There is no benefit from that. The rest of the internet is there for them. They don't need Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, or those.
Just a couple of comments coming in as you're saying that. I'm wondering if banning social media, says one person, for children is the solution. Wouldn't it make it even more desirable? Somebody else has just sent a comment saying banning substances isn't very successful. It often just creates more vice.
But it is successful. Yeah. When we raised the age to 21 for drinking alcohol in the US, the number of high school students drinking alcohol absolutely plummeted. Car accidents went way down among teenagers. It does work. Yes, some things will slip through the cracks, but it works. That idea that, oh, banning it never works. Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And
it also is about... I'm sorry, it also is about changing norms. We live in a world in which the norm is as soon as your kid is old enough to move their fingers, they get a touchscreen device, and then by about 7 or 8, they get their own TikTok account, because we don't have any sense that social media is not appropriate for children. So they see pornography, they see violence, they get hit on by men who want sex. And what we're trying to say here, and Australia was the first to do, is say, you know what? Let's just set a floor at 16. And this is not like any other thing that we're trying to regulate, because this is a trap. And the kids are on it, not because they're desperate to be on it because it's cool. They're on it because everyone else is on it. And multiple surveys this year show that teenagers support an age limit of 16. Not all of them, but majorities in many surveys now support putting an age limit of 16 because they know it's a trap.
And you know the criticism because you've heard it before, John, I know, but during a 2024 Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, Mark Zuckerberg from Meta said the majority of high-quality research out there suggests there is no causal connection at a broad scale between social media and teen mental health.
Yeah, so 2 things to note about that. The first is that what he's talking about there is the population level question. He's saying there's no evidence of a broad. That doesn't mean that we're not harming thousands or millions of children. So he's talking about the population level. Here's another thing. With all the dumps coming out, all the internal reports we're getting because of the lawsuits, I just got one last week in which, and this is roughly a quote, Meta researchers reviewing. In fact, it was because Jean and I were publishing on this in 2019, they had some of the researchers say, okay, what's going on here? And the researchers said the majority of high quality, I'm pretty sure they used the word high quality, the majority of high quality research shows that Facebook reduces well-being. So even their own internal research finds that at the population level. Jean, you want to add anything on that? That ridiculous claim Zuckerberg keeps making? There's no evidence. There's no evidence.
Yeah, their own research shows there's evidence. They reviewed the outside research and they concluded that there was evidence. They even did a randomized controlled trial themselves and found that cutting back or giving up Facebook ended up with better results, and we have a lot more evidence now than we did 10 years ago. 2 meta-analyses just in the last year. It concluded that as well, that social media reduction improves well-being.
But there are meta-analysis from 2021, from Ferguson, from Heifer in 2019. They're
immediately shown to have major errors. Major errors.
All right.
The Ferguson meta-analysis had only 5. He had only 5 studies that were about social media. The rest were about phone use. So Ferguson studies are we go through them. It's always easy to find out how he gets to 0.
Okay. Can I put in another couple of comments which are coming in, because this is lighting up as you would expect. So thank you very much. One from YouTube. How does John define social media versus the internet? For example, is YouTube social media? What's the difference between social media and the internet as far as you define it?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, there are a number of features. So think about it prototypically. There are prototypical social media sites where people are posting their own material, they're commenting on each other's, they're connecting in different ways, and there's a news feed. Those are the prototypical ones. On that definition, YouTube is technically social media. All of that stuff can happen. Now, in practice, most people are using YouTube as the world's video library, whereas they're using Instagram or Facebook or others to like post them, things like so. So they behave differently. But the Australian law originally excluded YouTube for that reason. But they did end up putting it back in because technically it's social media and because it is the most widely used platform of all, and a lot of bad stuff happens there to kids. So I think they were right to include it.
Okay, a few more comments. Why do governments strictly regulate TV and films with age ratings and censorship, but struggle to effectively regulate social media despite its greater exposure to children? John or Jean, which one of you wants to take that? Why is there a struggle for governments regulating social media in the way they might with television and films?
Well, originally, television and radio went out over public airwaves, and governments, and certainly in Britain, there was really the model of, we control it and we give licenses.
Absolutely.
When cable TV came in, that sort of loosened things up, and now you could say curse words and you could do all sorts of things. And the internet, the original internet, was a sort of a wild, amazing place where there were no rules, and it was kind of utopian early on. And it only got sort of dark and really nasty gradually as the advertising-based business model came in, as more criminals and scam artists figured out how to use it. So it's gotten nastier and more dangerous for kids sort of gradually. And then the other key thing is that, of course, many of us have been trying to get protections for kids for more than 10 years. In Britain, Biban Kidron was working on this since 2012, I think, 2013. The tech companies, and particularly Meta, have spent vast sums of money to stop us at every turn, to stop anything from being introduced in the House of Representatives in the United States. So we should have had this long ago, but this is the richest industry in the world. They're very smart, and they have stopped legislation. But they can't stop it at the state levels, and they can't stop it around the world. And that's why countries around the world now, just since January, 12 countries have either passed legislation or they say they're going to raise the age to 16. It's a global phenomenon now.
There's a comment from Baz Gonzalez. Thank you, Paz. I don't understand why there's so much fear around banning things that are known to be harmful, such as cell phones in schools. Neither parents nor schools nor politicians are willing to adopt that kind of policy. And for parents who want to encourage children to socialize, it becomes very difficult to go against the whole system. I just want to put a point there, actually, as somebody who works with a lot of neurodiverse adolescents. Sometimes it can be a lot more comfortable engaging on social media than it can in real life. And sometimes that is a way into them engaging in real life. So I know that, sometimes those areas are quite complex. There's a really interesting one here from Lewis Ward, who's a gamer. As someone who covers video games professionally, I wonder if the youth results differ significantly, at least for gamers who are heavily into social games where collaboration and teamwork is designed into the environment. I suppose there are certain environments, aren't there, where that team collaboration is encouraged. And I mean, have you done any research on that?
Yeah, Jean, why don't you take this? You're the big one for giving families specific advice for what to do.
Yeah, I haven't looked as much at gaming, so I'll pitch it to you in a sec,
Okay.
John. But it is true that solitary games are much more of a time sink without, really a whole lot of benefits. But yeah, when kids play games now, a lot of times they are playing in real time with their friends. It's not as obviously toxic as social media, and sure, but not when they're very young, not violent games, and there has to be a time limit. So that's what John's referring to about just putting time limits on that so it doesn't take over kids' lives. Because a lot of boys, they would play it all day, every waking moment, and not do anything else.
Yeah. And I'll just validate that. Yes, it is video games. There are pluses and minuses, where social media for kids, there are very few pluses. The minuses are gigantic. And that's why in my book, In the Anxious Generation, we didn't take a hard line on video games. We didn't say, don't let them play. We just said, watch the time. But I think what becomes really clear is two things. One, are they interacting with anonymous men who want sex or money? And that means no Roblox. Most of them, you're interacting with anonymous men who want sex or money from you. So most parents don't want their kids to be doing that. And the other is this an administration system for quick dopamine, or is this more strategic thinking and slower and collaborative? So some video games I think are good, but the problem for boys, I believe, is that their dopamine systems have been so hijacked by so many different companies. This includes sports betting and porn and all the gambling apps, and even investing is gamified. And so I think it's not wise to let your boys be getting very quick bursts of dopamine at the touch of a button. That's what wires your brain to be to find the rest of the world boring. So it tends to cause a lot of problems, but I can't say don't let your kids play, just restrict it.
Be aware of the platforms they're on and who else is communicating with them. I think as a parent, certainly that is good advice. There's a question here. Any thoughts on a 1 hour hard cap on the quotes infinite feed? If 1 hour of usage is correlated with an increase in life satisfaction, we don't want to lose those benefits.
Yeah, we do.
What do you think, John?
Yeah. Oh, well, again, it's not correlated with it. See, it's funny how our critics will, as soon as we point out a correlation, they say, oh, that's you can't prove anything from that. But here what we have is a simple correlation that the ones who are using 1 hour are a little happier than those who are not. And there's an obvious counter, which is in a world where everyone is on it, that person who's off is at a disadvantage. And also, the people who are off are also different in a lot of ways. Some of them are institutionalized. Some of them are off because they had such problems with it. There's the people who are on not at all are not the same kind of people as people who are on for one. So I do not believe there is any actual evidence or any experimental evidence that a 1 hour is better than 0 hours. And again, this is just social media. You still have the rest of the internet.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting discussion. Thank you so much, both of you, for being so involved and passionate and bringing us your research. And thank you as well to everybody who got in touch during that discussion. If I didn't get to your question or comment, forgive me, we are going back to this subject a little later on. But for the moment, John and Jean, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. You mentioned Cass Sunstein, and he's actually sent a message. One of the chapters in the report is about collective action in dealing with social media. And Cass wrote Nudge and is the author of that chapter. Can't be with us today, but we did manage to catch up with him earlier in the week to find out why he believes collective action is necessary. He recorded this message for us.
I'm Cass Sunstein. I teach at Harvard Law School. My chapter focuses on the effects of social media on well-being, and in particular the well-being of young people. And it identifies 3 puzzles that I think have solutions. The first is that people are willing to pay very little for a month of Facebook use, a social media platform, and this duplicates for other social media platforms. At the same time, they demand a lot of money to give up use of a social media platform, Facebook and others, for a month. That disparity between very low willingness to pay and a pretty high demand for money to be off is genuinely baffling. The best explanation, I think, points to 2 things. First is many people who are using social media platforms know that they are wasting their time, so they're not willing to pay much for it. And second, people who are asked to pay for use of social media platforms are mad because they've enjoyed those things for free. So this is a red flag and a clue that people who use social media platforms don't greatly value the fact that they're using them. The second study finds that people who demand significant sums of money to be off Facebook, in this case, the study involves Facebook, who were taken up on the offer, so they're off for a month, have a really good month. They are less anxious, they are less depressed, they're more satisfied with their lives, and they're just happier. So a month without Facebook is a quite good month. Then after that month, they're asked, how much would you demand to be off Facebook for another month? And they give a number that's almost as high as they gave at the beginning. That's puzzling, because having enjoyed a good month, they should say, you don't have to pay me anything. I'll pay you. I want to be off. The puzzle is, why do they demand significant sums? That's a red flag, again, that people might be addicted. That's one possibility. It may be that they're not focusing sufficiently or at all on whether social media use is making them better off or worse off. It might mean that they want to be part of a social network, even if being part of that social network is a bad thing for them. The third study poses that question concretely. So people are asked, how much would you demand to be off Instagram or TikTok, two different platforms, for a month? And this is limited to young people, people in college. And they demand a significant sum of money to be off, as in the first two studies. So far, we're seeing some stability among users. The third study asked people, how much would you demand to be off TikTok or Instagram for a month if part of the deal is everyone else in your community is going to be off for the month? We find for a substantial number of young TikTok users, a majority in fact, and a substantial number of young Instagram users, about half, if they can get off the platform and everyone else is off, then they say, oh, I like that. I'll pay you to bring about that situation. What makes that a remarkable finding, in a way staggering, is it suggests that people are willing to pay time and money to have access to a platform whose existence they don't like. They would favor the non-existence of the platform, but given the existence of the platform, they're going to demand a lot of money to get off. What we're finding there is that social media platforms are, for many young people, a good whose existence they deplore, but while it exists, they are going to use it. They are effectively trapped, it's a product trap, in a good whose existence would be better not around. Now, what we see from the three studies, if we take them together, is that lots of people are using platforms that they'd pay little or nothing to get access to, that they are being made more anxious, more depressed, sadder, less satisfied by their lives as a result of, and that they would demand a lot to get off, even though if they could coordinate and find a way to get off as a group, they would favor that situation. This is a very unusual good, if that's the right word for it. And what makes it an unusual good for many people is those who use it consider this particular good a bad.
Many thanks to Cass Sunstein for sending us that message. In the next panel, we are going to explore some more of the global data on social media use and well-being and the complexities it reveals. I'm joined again by John Helliwell, who we heard from earlier. Also joining us, Zeynep Ozkok, Associate Professor in Economics at St. Francis Xavier University. Pablo Gracia, who's Research Professor of Sociology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and Professor Martijn Burger, who's Erasmus University at Rotterdam. That's where they're from. John, you've been looking at a range of global data sets to try to understand the relationship between social media use and well-being around the world. What have you learned?
We, first of all, looked at what was in the Gallup report. And there are only two measures. One since 2017, do you have telephone access to the internet? And a second question asked only in 2022, which is, have you used social media in the last 30 days? Well, the problem with those data, as John and Zach have reminded us since we started working together on this, is that only relates to the internet and the social media use among the young. All of them had used it within the last 30 days. So that doesn't tell us what about different platforms, and B, it doesn't tell us anything much about how much people have been using and what things they've been using. So we learned from those data, in fact, that except in those four countries, United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, those who had telephone access to the internet and had used social media in the last 30 days compared to those who hadn't are happier everywhere in the world but in those four countries. But yet we had to dig deeper to try and find out how the structure of social media use might be lying behind those broad findings. So we were lucky in finding two extra sources and exploited them ruthlessly. One was two Latin American surveys, the NBRA survey in Mexico, where they had multiple measures of life evaluation, but they also had the amount of which social media was used and different types of social media. And there they were able to make a distinction between the two types of social media that Zach and Jean emphasize. And we found indeed that those who spent more of their time on these platforms they're most objecting to, in fact, had a lower life evaluation than those whose time was spent on the other types of platforms. We were also able to get from 18 countries in the Latino Barometral Survey those same platforms use. So we would then test that proposition that there were these two types of social media, and one was less helpful or more harmful than the other. And we found that indeed that distinction was there, not monstrous, however. And we found in those Latin American countries that by and large, the users were happier than the non-users, even for some of the worse platforms. So that ability to have high social media use without being less happy for it doesn't carry. It's something that Latin American culture. So it led us to focus a little more on how these platforms are used and how they play into the social context in which people live. Then we got back to also using the PISA data that Jean had directed us to in the first instance, because they are comparable measures of 15-year-olds, a very sensitive group in this whole discussion, and of life. And then we've got 47 countries. We expanded the coverage. Jean, in those graphs she talked about, or the evidence she talked about, showed girls and boys, girls more affected than boys in terms of hours of social media use. We then said, well, that's just one use of the internet. And then we found, as I think John and Zach were emphasizing, that there are many kinds of internet use. And we found that that was just one of 7. And in general, people were better off with the other sorts of internet use than the social media use. In particular, people use communication-based media. They got more benefit from them or less harm. What we did find is that this too much is too much applies to all internet uses, not just social media. So the pattern for social media was rather similar to that elsewhere. We were able to distinguish also the people who were not social media users because they simply were disadvantaged in a lot of ways that didn't even let them have either the time or the resources to connect to social media. So we were able to use those other internet activities. So when our study of social media, we exclude all those who have no internet connection. We're just looking at the 98.5% of these 15-year-olds around the world who do have internet connections. The ones who don't, they were less good in school and less happy. Now, focusing on the picture, if you want to bring it up, we said, well, wait a minute. Now we've got these data. We can go and look at other things about these lives because they tell you a lot about the lives of these 15-year-olds. So one of the striking things we found first was we were able to measure the same kind of costs that Jean was estimating. We did the same thing. And we said, let's compare those. Let's take someone from a 10% position in the, change them from a 90% user to a 10% user of social media, which is where all the damage goes on, and compare that to equivalent change in a sense of school belonging, because we have the same data there as well. And we found that, lo and behold, these are significant differences from the social media, but they were 4 to 6 times smaller than the movement in social belonging in the school. So we said, we don't want to ignore the damage that things like social media used wrongly can do. But if we're really serious about young people, we should say, how do you create a sense of belonging in a class structure, in a classroom structure, because that's what's really important to people, is how much they feel connected to the people with whom they spend their days. We were then able to say, we could get at this causal structure in a way that Zeynep will tell you they were doing, but we were able to do it rather nicely with these data from PISA, because we're worried, of course, about not just that people who are use a lot of social media are unhappy, but that people who are unhappy use a lot of social media.
Yes.
So we could correct for that, because in each school, we know how much social media is used by the other people, not by them. And similarly with belonging, you say, I'm measuring I'm high on belonging just because I say I'm high on all good things. You said, I'm not going to use the belonging measure for me. I'm going to use the belonging measure for the other people in my class. And we use what's called instrumental variables and take those other people's estimates of the environment in which I'm living and use that. It turns out there is quite a big effect of that downward slope that's coming from the fact that the people you're getting at were unhappy for some other reason and then became heavy social media users. Yes. So that's an important issue. I don't want to take too much of the time. You can.
But it's a really good point, John. And one I want to pick up with Zeynep, that one of the biggest debates is whether spending more hours on social media makes young people unhappy, or whether unhappy people spend more time on social media. And that sort of clever experiment, Zeynep, that you did. Tell us more about that and what it raised for you, what you found.
Thank you very much for this question. Initially we started our chapter with the following question. Do internet and social media use affect our subjective well-being, not only directly, but also indirectly by altering levels of trust and social connections? So we use a large data set of survey responses from 30 European countries between 2016 and 2024 from the European Social Survey. But in addressing the question, as you pointed out, we needed to really go back to the problem of reverse causality. So is using the internet more making individuals, particularly younger people, less happy? Or are the individuals spending more time online because they are unhappy? So to untangle this problem, we used internet access speed data from Measurement Lab as our natural experiment. So this became our instrumental variable for the internet use. So our hypothesis was the following. Higher internet access speeds will result in increased internet use for individuals in this external way, which in turn may affect their well-being. So this helped us correct for the problem of reverse causality. And once we did correct for this problem, our estimates revealed that higher daily internet use was actually reducing well-being on average. Importantly, the magnitude and even the direction of this effect differed substantially across generations. Internet use in our results was most harmful for Gen Z, moderately harmful for millennials, close to neutral for Gen X, and slightly beneficial for baby boomers. So these findings really showed us that there was this evidence that the role of the internet in daily life is deeply shaped by age-specific social contexts and needs. So we took the analysis one step further, and we also looked at the environmental effect of how many people in each peer group were using social media. This is basically their participation in social networks, like creating profiles, posting messages. So the peer groups were constructed as individuals who live in the same country, who are in the same age cohort, who are the same gender. So once these effects were included, our results were really mirroring what we were earlier finding on. As more people in your peer group started using social media, the effect of internet use on your well-being really started becoming more and more negative. I really like the way my co-author John puts it. We can think of the social media peer group exposure as like a temperature sensor. So in low exposure settings where the temperature is low, there's not a lot of social media exposure that people are feeling, internet use actually has a positive effect on well-being. But as soon as that temperature gauge starts really heating up, where we see highly saturated digital environments where social media dominates online activity, the effect of internet use on well-being becomes progressively more negative. So once we account for this peer group social media use, we really find that the digital environment is ecological. Individuals are not only affected by their own online habits, but also by the online habits of everyone around them, which basically suggests to us that this is not solely an individual problem, but more of a public problem, as discussed in some of the other chapters of the World Happiness Report this year.
Thank you very much, Zeynep. So many interesting points there. I love John's point of too much is too much. And you were mentioning, Zeynep, there it being an ecological problem. Turning to you, Pablo, because you've been looking at a different data set, and this covers 43 countries, focusing on the socio-economic status of a young person's family and how that influences their relationship with social media. Tell us more about that.
Yes, thanks, Jan. So basically, what we did in our study is to try to understand how problematic social media use, which is a validated scale that looks at abusive and addictive related types of social media, how this is related to adolescent mental well-being. But our particular focus was to look at whether this association between these two variables, which has been quite well documented in previous literature, whether this varies depending on the family socioeconomic status of these adolescents. This chapter is also part of our project, a larger project funded by the European Research Council, where we are combining cross-national data, longitudinal data, as well as experimental and mobile app data to try to understand not only these mechanisms, that, for example, Zeynep now, but also John were articulating very well, how these mechanisms work, but also what's the role of socioeconomic status. Theoretically, what we expected was that in families with higher socioeconomic resources, there might be the possibility that these adolescents are embedded in a more privileged environment. For example, we know from the literature that adolescents that are from lower socioeconomic status, they tend to have parents who are either jobless or have economic constraints. We know also that this can be related to flexibility in the job, but also we have literature showing that digital skills, but also digital parenting vary depending on the socioeconomic status of families. So we expected that as a result of this context, in families with lower socioeconomic resources, this association between problematic social media use and the expected lower mental well-being could be more pronounced than in families where these effects might be, or these associations might be less pronounced because of the mechanisms that I was mentioning. Before I go to the main findings here, Sean, let me stress here that our study, like the majority of the studies that are published this year in the World Happiness Report 2026, are correlational. Okay, this doesn't mean that this information is not right, and I really like the approach that Zeynep is here providing. We have evidence showing that social media use, and particularly high levels of social media use, can lead to lower mental health. But we also have a lot of empirical evidence showing that the direction of the causality can also go in the other direction. So what we have to tell the audience is to be very honest, but also be very transparent on the type of data that we are presenting to generate digital literacy, that we are talking about. Though our study is correlational, we were using very high quality data from the HBSC, which is cross-sectional, but it's also representative of these 43 countries that we were analyzing. We could cover most of the countries were European, like the Anglo-Celtic countries, Mediterranean countries, as well as the Black Sea and the Caucasus and some other European regions. So what did we find in our study? First of all, when we look at the general sample, we found some pattern that has been also quite clear in the other chapters. The relationship between problematic social media use and lower adolescent mental well-being was more pronounced in the category that we call the Anglo-Celtic, which is basically Canada, the UK, and the Republic of Ireland. And in this context, this association was more pronounced. And interestingly, of all the regions that we were comparing, we found that in the Caucasus Black Sea, so a diversity of countries from that region, this association was less pronounced. This is already by speaking to the other chapters of this contribution, the World Happiness Report 2026. A general pattern that we found, and we could control for a number of factors, was that this association was more pronounced for adolescents who came from families from lower socioeconomic status. So we found that even if this association happened in general among all, or tended to happen to adolescents that were engaging in social media activities that were more addictive, we did find that this was more pronounced in lower SES adolescents compared to higher SES adolescents. We also interestingly found that this association was more clear for life satisfaction and less so for psychological complaints. Life satisfaction captures precisely the Cashel scale that all our colleagues were presenting at the beginning of this session, which is more evaluative. But interestingly, the effects for psychological complaints were not that pronounced. And this is something that really, we found quite interesting. And also, when we look at this gap by socioeconomic status, what we found is that, again, the English-speaking countries, those that we call the Anglo-Celtic countries, so they were showing higher socioeconomic gaps in this association between problematic social media use and adolescent well-being compared to the other countries. And in the other regions that we found less pronounced relationships, we found those countries that are in the cluster of the Mediterranean countries. And just to conclude here, I think it's important to say here that the fact that different family level contexts, but also different country level or regional context, the fact that these mechanisms or these processes differ depending on this context is already telling us something, that we not only look at the online world, but also we need to look at the social world and the offline world, and how the psychological and the social things that happen also outside the online world can actually affect what is happening in the online world. So we believe that these two things need to be put together. Thanks, Sean.
That's fascinating, Pablo. I want to pick up on that last point because I'm thinking about geopolitics and what part that plays into this as well. The news, as we know, in recent weeks has been dominated by events in the Middle East. I want to go to Martijn because your chapter focuses specifically on that region. How does social media use in the Arab world compare to other regions? And can you argue that social media might have been a force for good in countries where freedom of expression is hard to come by? What do you think, Martijn?
Well, thank you for this interesting question. And if you look at the Middle East, what surprised me most actually when we started conducting the research is how widespread and intensive social media use actually is in this region. But also on how much it varies between countries. So if you look at heavy use, and we define heavy use in our chapter as spending more than 5 hours per day on social media, then you see that in Morocco, there's only 15% of the users can be classified as heavy users, while this is like well over 40% in countries like Lebanon or Kuwait. If you look at the type of use, they use very much similar platforms, but there are also clear differences with the Western world. If you look at social media use, and as you already mentioned, there's the role of gender norms, there's religion that plays a bigger role on social media, but also like government surveillance. But at the same time, like if you look at the relationship with well-being, there are also some patterns that are remarkably similar to what we see in Western countries. Like if you pick heavy use, that is consistently associated with lower well-being. And we see that in our chapter. We use Eurobarometer data for 14 different countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And we see that especially social media use becomes problematic at high intensity. So once people spend more than about 5 hours per day on social media, we consistently observe lower well-being. So people report more stress, more depressive symptoms, but also more negative comparisons with others. And a key mechanism we think, but we cannot formally test in this, is time loss. So like less time spent on meaningful activities, including like meeting face to face, and also maybe sleep quality, but also social comparisons. So we already discussed that social media exposes people to highly curated and often idealized versions of other people's lives, and that makes them feel worse about their own situation. But what we also see is that it's not all type of excessive use might necessarily be harmful. We see particularly that excessive use is harmful when people use multiple platforms, when they interact with influencers. That is also what we were able to see in our data. But also not only with excessive influence, but also when they follow like the news, via social media. So probably leading to feelings of negative emotions. So it's not only about excessive use per se, but we should also have in that regard a discussion when we talk about social media, how we use it, and that can also be a link to policy in that sense, that we teach kids in schools on how to use social media in a healthy way that is not harmful to their mental health.
Yes, thank you, Martijn. Just to add to that, as somebody who did visit Finland, one of the things they do is teach media literacy at a young age. And I wonder whether that feeds into this debate as well, because I know some governments around the world are now looking at that, getting in younger and teaching children how to look at disinformation, misinformation, which platforms to use. I just want to briefly close this panel with a question to John. It is going to be a very brief one, John, I'm afraid, but there's one question that's come in to us. How do you think about messaging platforms, or what do you think about messaging platforms which allow both communication and social sharing, like WhatsApp and Telegram? Which category do they fall into when you talked about two types of social media, where one has a lower sense of well-being, one has a sense of higher? What do you think about communication and social sharing? Are they okay?
Absolutely. The evidence we get from both sources I was talking about favors those communication channels over the others. And as I think everybody on all these panels has that agreement that the more the internet is used for making positive social connections, the better it is for the world. And it's best for those who otherwise didn't have many, but it's good for everybody. What we're talking about is problematic uses of some of those channels, and that difference. The questioner asked about those platforms, and those platforms came out very well in our studies, but in moderation.
In moderation, as you're saying, too much is too much. I particularly like that. That's going to be my motto. Thank you very much, John. Thanks to Zeynep and Pablo and Martijn as well. Before we move on to our final panel, you might be aware that the Australian government recently increased the age limit for 10 social media platforms from 13 to 16. Many countries are considering similar policies. Before we get into that debate, we're going to watch one of the most famous television adverts in Australia, which demonstrates how much they care about the happiness of their population.
Australia has dropped out of the top 10 happiest countries list for the first time ever.
That can't be right.
Is this real?
Yep, we're 11th. Look it up.
We're not behind the Poms, are we? God, no.
How can any country be happier than Australia? Australia's the best country on earth. And when there's a competition, we're in it to win it.
When those happiness auditors come next year, you show them we're a top 10 happy country.
Boy, it'll be a chop for you. Not the succulent lamb kind. Got it?
What? Yes, boss. G'day.
Formal greetings.
How was your flight?
Long, please begin.
Nothing would make us happier. How could you not be happy with 50,000 kilometres of beautiful coastline?
You could say we're girt by it.
Can one swim here?
At your own peril.
Let's move on.
You know what makes us happy? The Sydney Opera House. We should show you that.
Your nation enjoys opera.
And how could you not be happy holding a platypus?
The world's only venomous egg-laying mammal. Yeah, nah, mate, I wouldn't hold...
We also have free healthcare.
You should write that down.
Another reason we're happy is because we're made up of many different cultures.
Including the world's oldest living continuous cultures.
Sucked in Egypt. Respectfully.
We've got world-class summer Olympians.
And well-meaning winter Olympians.
There's heaps more to be happy about, like backyard water parks, sporting equipment that doubles as bins.
You can call someone your mate, even if they're not your mate.
And all our animals come with pockets.
And we got giant monuments to fruit.
And hardware stores where sausages outsell tools.
I didn't know they sold tools.
And the other nations might be happy on paper, but we get paid more than New Zealanders for doing exactly the same jobs.
I'm 19 to 35% happier here.
And Sweden has saunas, but we've got Townsville. And Finland might enjoy unlimited parental leave, but can they pop down to the shops in their togs?
There you go.
Then there's these, a national network of free public barbecues.
You wouldn't get that in Luxembourg.
If that's even a real country.
If this isn't top 10 happiness stuff, then what is?
As I've explained many times, the list is based on complex economic...
Shh! Enjoy the taste of 100% real Australian happiness.
I'm just waiting for a mate.
A succulent Chinese meal.
You know it makes sense.
Where did all these people come from?
Nothing makes us happier than being together, and nothing brings us together like lamb.
So we're top 10 happy country?
I have a feeling this year that you will make the cut. Let.
Just ate some lamb.
Oh, we should show you Canberra. Actually, nah.
We all want to go to Australia. A light-hearted take on the importance of measuring happiness. We're going to turn our attention now, though, to the serious business of evidence-based policy making. And for that, I'm joined by Sophie Lloyd-Hurwitz, who's a master's graduate from the Oxford Internet Institute, and Andy Przybylski, who's Professor of Human Behaviour and Technology at the Oxford Internet Institute. So, Sophie, there's been so much research published on the topic of happiness and social media. What attempts have been made to bring all this evidence together and make recommendations to policymakers?
Yeah, hi, Sean. Thanks for the question. I think definitely something to take away from all this is the volume of research that has been published in the last decade, 2 decades. It's just grown absolutely exponentially. And we can obviously tell by the theme of this year's World Happiness Report that it's something that people really care about. So having that massive amount of research really requires much more of an effort in terms of synthesizing that and making sense of what is just an increasing amount and plethora of information out there. So how can we make sense of that in a way that is actually meaningful, that's going to have some utility for policymakers, for parents, people who care about, the answer to this question. And there's certainly been lots of attempts to do that. Lots and lots and lots of people have been writing various synthesis reports. There are things like professional organizations. So the APA is one of them, the American Psychological Association. There's also the National Academies of Science, as well as the US Surgeon General. Those are 3 that we focused on. But it's important to note that in addition to them, there's also like government white papers and advocacy organizations, and lots of groups write their own synthesis of the available research that's out there. I think the task of trying to collate all that information into something actionable and meaningful and comprehensible really is one that's really, really hard. And yeah, in our chapter, we focus on 3 major science organizations from the States. And the World Happiness Report is obviously very international, has got a lot of data from around the world, as you've just heard from our other co-authors in the edition this year. But we focus primarily in the US because these 3 reports were all produced in the same year, within 18 months of each other, in the same national context. So you'd assume that these 3 organizations are all dealing with the same literature base to work from. So when they're asked, hey, let's make sense of all of this information on social media and adolescent mental health, it's all in 2023 to 2024. It's all in the US. And these are all very well-funded, well-resourced, and very reputable organizations. It would be easy to assume that they would all come up with the same answer to the question. And I think the starting point for us, for our research, was the note that they didn't quite all say the same thing, which is fascinating given the shared focus in the same time period.
Yes, thank you. And Andy, you and Sophie have been looking at these major reports very carefully, comparing their approaches. What are the main differences between them, do you think?
Well, Sophie, you're, of course, welcome to jump in at any point. I think one of the most interesting things that Sophie found here was that actually the overlap between the actual research that was tapped into was really small. So the National Academy of Sciences by far was the most comprehensive and exhaustive investigation into kind of what does the evidence have to say. And the other two were quite a bit smaller, both in terms of their length and about how they drew on the scientific evidence base. But one of the things that really had us scratching our heads is the fact that really only 1% of hundreds and hundreds of articles was really overlapped between these three things. So it didn't matter if you were like, a scientist advising the American Psychological Association or the US Surgeon General or a blue ribbon American task force meant to pull all the science together. People were fundamentally looking at different experiments. They were looking at different longitudinal studies. They were looking at different surveys. And that jumped out to us immediately that there must be something kind of really interesting going on, that it might not actually be that everyone's doing the same thing when they're trying to draw together the best evidence. And that just led us down just a number of really interesting paths, because often if a study isn't done very well, or if the authors are motivated to produce a result that's consistent with their pre-existing biases, whether they're conscious or not, these types of low quality studies, they can generate like headline grabbing results. But we really hadn't thought that maybe there were quality differences in the syntheses themselves. And that's really where Sophie kind of really, where the rubber met the road there.
That's so interesting, because science is confusing and complex and nuanced and evolving. And that's the beauty of it, I guess, if you're in that area. But it also means that sometimes you don't have the definitive answer that everybody will look at and everybody will take. So what is there a sort of, I don't know, the best meta-analysis that we can look at, or the best of all the systematic reviews? Is there a place that we can go as parents, as policymakers, as individuals, to get a conclusive answer to how much social media, which social media is best, what's causing the rise in anxiety? What do you think, Andy?
Well, I mean, I'll just start by saying it's been almost 18 years since Tanya Byron published the Byron Review here in the UK.
Yeah.
And, that laid out actually 38 or 36 or 38 concrete steps, including comprehensive media literacy, parent and teacher training, the allocation of resources in schools to empower young people. I think that one of the things, and Sean, it's built into your question a bit, but like one of the things that's built into maybe this whole conversation today that I find as a parent also a bit dispiriting is this is all about the negatives. And we're not really talking about how to empower young people and how to empower families. And I think that this panic that's been caused by low quality evidence and kind of hysterical claims around some of these topics, like there are really dangerous things about the online world, and we do have to keep kids safe and teens safe. But that goes hand in hand with actually empowering them. And there's something a bit amotivating about telling people that their fates are being controlled by a handful of large, evil North American companies. And that removes critical agency from our communities, from our schools, and from our families.
So, Sophie, given the differences between all these reports, as Andy's pointing out, how do we empower young people? And I guess how should policymakers proceed when trying to make a decision about what is best to advise parents and young people?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I also want to pick up something that you said in your question to Andy, which is where can we go for a definitive answer here? Like, what is the perfect meta-analysis? And that's something that Andy also and I have been talking about as I've been working on this project. Like, what would it look like if this meta-analysis was done perfectly, if this synthesis report was communicated with perfect fidelity to the research? Like, what is the ideal outcome here? And I think it's really hard to say. I also think it is important to remember that uncertainty in science is not a failure of science, but is actually the entire point of the scientific enterprise. So learning through error and error and error and biases and confusion, and then sorting through that muddle to produce an outcome is really important and part of the process. So I think something that I want the audience to take away is that the nuance and the complexity is not a failure of the research, but is in fact very central to what it means to produce high quality research, especially in the social sciences, where you're looking at how people's well-being and mental health are being correlated or impacted by certain social things. Is very difficult to measure, and which is why we've got all of these different measures for things like well-being, as the other authors have been talking about. There's lots of considerations to make when you're choosing variables to measure. And all of these things consistently come up in the social media field as potential problems of why it's really difficult to measure and why it is so hard to answer this question, especially as social media itself keeps changing year in, year out, even quicker than that, month in, month out. Research is a slow process of sort of acquiring knowledge. And the fact that we found most studies that are being cited either talk about social media generally, so that collapses every social media into one. And as there have been questions today, like that boundary is really difficult to describe. But other than that, there's lots of studies on Facebook, which is a lot less popular now than it was 10, 15 years ago. Very few studies on things like TikTok, which are like newer. And so I think trying to get a definitive answer, and this isn't a very affirming response that I'm giving, is that there is no answer, but it is partly true that I think trying to say, here's the final answer, case closed, is not in the spirit of what scientific knowledge discovery is.
Yes,
and I think continuing to nail down specifically what it is about online environments that might perpetuate more harmful environments versus maybe more inane circumstances is really, really important to make policies that are not only effective, but also protect mental health in the best possible ways and don't unnecessarily influence or impact millions of young people throughout the world needlessly.
Yes, and a comment's just come in saying, uncertainty is not a failure of science, it's a necessary component of it. Well said. Absolutely. And of course, we are living in an uncertain world, aren't we? And there's a lot of anxiety around. And I guess what the brain tends to do, it doesn't like a vacuum, is it goes, okay, what information do I need in order to clear this vacuum and get definitive answers? And what I hear you both saying is the definitive answer isn't there yet. So we've got to make do with basically the best possible evidence that we have for policymakers, but as individuals as well. So Andy, what do you think the implications are here for us as individuals, for policymakers, but for the research community as well? What more can be done so that we can feel perhaps not certain, but we can control the controllables? We know in which direction we can go.
Yeah, so I'm not going to just try to give the world advice on this, because I think, all kids are different, even the same kid. And advice that works on Monday doesn't work on Wednesday or Friday. But we sorry, I have a 9 and a 12-year-old.
Yes,
so
I've got 5 children and I know exactly what you mean.
Things are live there.
Yes.
And our family are spread out across 4 continents, and so it's very different in different parts of the world. But I mean, one of the things that we're clear about is that if we're going to for sources of advice, these have to be, in sources of guidance, these have to be sources that don't feign confidence or overconfidence. This is an uncertain domain. It's somewhere between how far do you let your kid wander, at what age, to what shops in your village or your town or your city, and helping them navigate themselves through puberty and sexual maturity. This is the online world is so large now, and it's encompassed so many parts of our lives that separating out this part of parenting or this part of teaching or this part of society from other bits and just pretending that we can lock it in a cupboard or stick our head in the sands, does a tremendous disservice to young people. And so I would just say that, from scientists, like, I would try to follow advice from people who, this is in our chapter, but like people who engage with disconfirming evidence, people who, when they put a citation in a paper, if you go and read and check that citation is consistent with the sentence that it comes from. And we're crystal clear, and so Sophie's crystal clear. We identified 6 metrics by which you can judge an evidence-based review, and you can combine that on some level with what we know makes for good science. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think as countries are grappling with this and hopefully resourcing, empowering parents and empowering young people, one of the key things that needs to happen, and our chapter is clear on this for evidence-based reviews, is we need to hold ourselves to a high account. We need to, it's not hard to use references and citations properly. You don't have to use ChatGPT for this, okay? It's just important that we're as careful with synthesizing evidence and drawing conclusions and providing suggestions as we are with doing, basic research. And so, I mean, I would encourage anyone, especially, I look up stuff for the kids all the time on the NHS. And there's 2 dates at the bottom of every piece of health advice for the NHS. The most recent date that a piece of advice has been reviewed by, someone acting in our national health best interest, and the next date that there's going to be an evidence review to see if this is the right use for ibuprofen, the right use for an antidepressant, the right way to talk about an expecting mom and what's, an expecting parent. And that process has to enter the digital age.
Yes, no, I couldn't agree more. Trusted sources and also media literacy, which I know we spoke about a little bit earlier. It's interesting as well that I was listening to Action for Happiness, Lord Richard Layard, we were hearing from earlier. We launched it back in, 15 years ago. I was there when the launch happened. They have 3 positive responses to dealing with social media, which is choose, curate, and connect. So you're choosing which sources you go to, you're connecting, so you're looking for the good, and you're curating, you're making sure that those sources you go to are right, and those that don't serve you and are harmful, and you can notice what's going on with you and how you react to social media, curate it. If it's not serving you, then perhaps it's not good for you. That was so interesting. Thank you both. It's been a fascinating couple of hours. Thank you to all of you who've been joining us on YouTube and on various social media platforms, and for all your comments. We really value them. I know a lot of you didn't get your question answered today, but John and Richard and Jan are going to be doing a Reddit AMA. Now, I don't know whether you call it AMA or AMA.
AMA.
Ask me. You see, I should have asked the expert. Andy knows.
Sorry.
Andy is schooling me. A Reddit AMA. A Reddit AMA. That means ask me anything next Thursday. So next Thursday, John, Richard, and Jan, and they, of course, are the authors behind the report. You can find out much more details as well about that at worldhappiness.report. Before we finish, let's take a moment to thank everyone who's contributed to this year's report. That is all the editors and the authors and the external reviewers. Gallup, who provide early access to their world poll data. The report's partners, Ajinomoto, Bloom Wellbeing Fund, Blue Zones, Girlico, Ely Cafe, and the Ernesto Illy Foundation. And of course, the production team who've managed to put all this together, Barry, Leonie, Charlotte, Jonathan, Ryan, John, and Stephanie. And thank you to you for joining us today and engaging with this important topic. If you haven't already, please visit worldhappiness.report to read the report, because it is fascinating. It always is every year, and it brings in new information from different sources. It's well worth a look. And you can look at this year's chapters and explore the data dashboard as well to learn more about happiness in your own country. That's all from me and the team. Thank you once again. Goodbye.